Perfect. Great. So welcome, Sylvia, and welcome to those of you that might be watching this recording online. It's great to have you with us in whatever format you're joining us. In today's session, we're going to be exploring rejoicing in the generosity of God, responding to the generosity of God, and both in a kind of what that means. So that's kind of what I'm going to be exploring in the introduction, and then Christine and Jenny will be exploring some more practical elements of that, thinking about giving reviews and other new ways of doing that. Just before I get into it then, I just wonder if it's worth just going around quickly and just saying our names. You already did a little bit of this, but I'm Daniel. I'm one of the Generous Giving Advisors covering the more western parts of the diocese, and I job share with Christine.
Yeah, and I'm Christine, and I am another Generous Giving Advisor, and I'm in the middle of Cornwall, covering 3 dioceses in the middle of 3 deaneries, even in the middle of Cornwall.
Hi, I'm Jenny, and I'm another Generous Giving Advisor covering the east of Cornwall. So that will be your area as well, Sylvia, and I will get down to see you at some point.
Wonderful. And Sylvia, you were telling us that you're a treasurer, is that right? And you're from Roche.
Yes.
Lovely. Well, it's lovely to have you with us. I'm just going to pray and then I'll get on with my little introductory session. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for the time we're going to spend now. I ask that the words we share are from you. I ask that they land well. And Lord, I ask that everything that's said now, all the discussion that's had, all the presentations would be a blessing and a resource to those that might engage with this at a later date. We ask this in your precious name, Lord. Amen. Amen. Great. I'm just going to share my screen. So yes, as I was saying, hi everyone, my name is Daniel Mantell Roberts. I don't know if I forgot to say that earlier. I've just got married and we double barreled, so I'm still getting used to it. But yes, my name is Daniel Mantell Roberts. And yeah, in my introductory session today, I want to think a little bit about what it means to respond, to rejoice in the generosity of God. So Christians, as Christians, we believe in a generous God. That is a God that gave up everything for us and gave everything we could ever need. In 2 Corinthians, Paul describes this generosity as abundant, and this blessing and goodness as extravagant and bountiful. And of course, we see that in the giving of Jesus Christ for us and to us in the incarnation, and what was given up on the cross for us. And I think one of the most exciting things about thinking about generosity is actually recognizing instances in our own lives or the lives of those around us where we have experienced God's generosity. So often, things happen in our lives, and then when we kind of pause to reflect on them, we can say, yes, actually, that there was an expression of God's generosity in my life. I know that I've personally experienced this recently through the form of church community. At the end of last year, I was in a really difficult position between houses. My landlord needed me to leave. The housing market in Cornwall is very difficult at the moment. And actually, I was inundated with offers of generous hospitality from people from the church, telling me that I could go stay with them. And actually, in that moment, I recognized that as a real God thing, God working through church community to extend generosity and blessing to me. And actually, that was a fantastic example of those people stewarding their blessings, their homes, their spare rooms, their assets, stewarding them and offering them generously to bless others. Now, as part of our work, we were asked to give a similar talk to this a little while ago. And in preparation for that, we put together a little video of case studies where we asked friends and colleagues from around the diocese to give us stories and examples of God's generosity to them. And if I just share that video with you now, we can hear some of those case studies. This is a slightly shorter version of the one we have made before, but the full version is available on YouTube, and we will circulate the link to that after that. That full version is about 10 minutes long. And don't tell anyone, but I did cut Bishop Philip's section, so if he ever finds out, I'll have to beg his forgiveness.
Hi everyone. A simple story of God's generosity to me. And it's the story of how something very small and at the time completely insignificant opened up a whole world to me, which genuinely changed my life. And it took place when I was about 20, 21 years old, just coming to the end of my time at university, wasn't sure what I was going to do with life, knew some things I didn't want to do, didn't want to go and work in a bank, didn't want to go and be a lawyer, but had no idea what I did want to do, except that I knew that there was something about community that really mattered to me, seemed to be kind of important in some way. And I was in an Oxfam secondhand bookshop, and there on the bookshelf was a book that said Community and Growth, and it had the word community in it, so I bought it. It was £2.50 or whatever, and I read that book, and it was a book all about a community called L'Arche, a Christian community called L'Arche, and I was blown away by that book, completely captivated by the vision it painted of a way of life with people with learning disabilities as Christians together. And I went and I had a look at the community and said I'd go and live there for a year, which is what they asked for, and I eventually left nearly 15 years later, having been changed and reshaped and remolded by the people with learning disabilities that I lived with, by the way of life of the community, and by God in ways that I could not possibly have imagined. God's generosity to me began with a second-hand book in an Oxfam bookshop.
The path of life that God has had us on has mostly been one of living by faith, and we have often been concerned about whether there would be enough money at the end of the month, and many times we've panicked and looked at our bank balance and wondered what would happen next. And then we've prayed, and God has always answered us, often through a gift from someone, sometimes only a small amount, but in itself enough to increase our faith for the rest. And amongst this, there have been times when we've experienced God's overwhelming generosity, providing for us when we couldn't provide for ourselves. Not just financially, although often in that way. We were once given the use of a holiday let for 2 nights, which gave us much needed rest. We've had meals provided by friends or others willing to care for our children when we've needed it. Always through God's faithful and obedient followers, sacrificially giving. This in turn has taught us to be generous with what we have, with our resources and time and love, because we've understood now that it's all God's anyway. I'm not saying we're always perfect at it, but that's what we try to do. Trying to learn to hold it lightly for the time that we're the custodians, until the time when it's ready to pass it on and bless another.
To think of God's generosity, it's hard not to see that in Cornwall. It's just everywhere with the beauty and creation that he's given us. But thinking about money, I've just recently finished my second degree studying theology and helping to run a church in Cornwall at the same time, just before moving here. And in that time, obviously I couldn't get a student loan, I couldn't get any support in my finances paying for my degree. And in that time I set up some support from different congregation members who were giving me money, helping me through this time, and no matter how much was thrown at us, it was amazing how always the right money turned up to support me and my family. In that time we had our first child as well, and my wife was on maternity leave, I was studying, helping run a church, and once on Dartmoor we were up there praying and just worrying and thinking, God, how are we going to do this? Our child's coming, neither of us work full time, what are we going to do? And as we got home we got a message saying that someone has just donated £1,000 into our bank. And it's as if in that moment when we were praying, when we were worrying, God was listening and was generous in nudging someone we know to love us and care for us and support us in that time.
God's generosity is in my daily living, but I know I don't always recognise it. My first 42 years I lived my life not knowing Jesus as I do now, only as a historical sad story with no conception of what it meant for me and others. Then Jesus was introduced to me and I accepted him into my life. That is the time when God was very generous to me. I've had the experience, I like to think, of a time without any thought of God being generous, and a time with a big-hearted, generous God. I cannot compare any other smaller way of sharing his generosity, only the cross.
Fantastic. I'll just move on to the next slide there. Of course, rejoicing in the generosity of God and kind of celebrating God's generosity is only half of the story. There's kind of, I guess, rejoicing and response. God doesn't bless us abundantly so that we can hold all these possessions closely to us, but actually, as one of those testimonies was saying, so that we can hold it lightly, and that we can then in turn give them away and do so joyfully and generously. We should therefore not see the money that we have either personally or as churches as ours, but rather as God's, and that we are called to receive these gifts and sensibly manage them in a way that reflects his generosity. This acknowledges that God ultimately owns absolutely everything. And if God owns all things and we own nothing, then it follows that all we possess is really held in a trusteeship, and we act as the stewards. And I guess that's where the idea of stewardship comes in. In fact, the first and second commandments in the scripture are stewardship commands. Go forth and multiply and look after the garden, because both are about how humankind stewards the resources, the life, the literal bodies that we're given in order to honor and bless others. Turner and Kleinard describes stewardship in this way, and the difference that stewardship makes in a Christian conviction as opposed to a kind of general idea of just doing good with your money. This is what he says. Stewardship means holding in trust, using an investment, that which belongs to someone else. Christian stewardship includes that basic understanding of stewardship, but it's essentially a life of response to God for his goodness and to Jesus Christ for his love. In this way, our teaching and example needs to demonstrate that stewardship is not merely about fundraising or the church or even isolated things like mission, but rather it's about a lifestyle and a way of life, a way of generosity, brought about by moving into a fuller and more faithful response to God's generosity to us in the first instance. And of course, in this particular webinar, we're not just thinking about individual stewardship, how we use our resources, but we're thinking about stewardship of a church community. As leaders, treasurers, church wardens, we all play a massive role in the culture of a church and the way that we respond to God's gifts on a wider, more corporate level. Seeking to address the financial stewardship element of a church is to address the relationship that we as a corporate community have to our blessings, to our money, and so forth. So part of our teaching ministry must be to help people see that they make choices about all their spending. And I guess in some ways, this is a difficult and countercultural message. We're often told that, you know, if you work hard, you earn much, and that is yours to spend as you please. Or conversely, that if you're in a position where you can't work and that something is given to you, that you perhaps don't deserve it. Actually, the message that we have here is completely different, right? It's that much has been given to us. We might have worked for much, but actually it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's all held in stewardship, and we need to respond out of generosity. And indeed, when it comes to approaching a difficult message of stewardship and giving in the church, it's worth remembering that when we look at the example of the Bible, there are 500 verses pertaining to topics of faith and prayer, yet over 2,350 relating to money and giving and so forth. We can see even from the life and example of Jesus and what he spoke about and what meant most to him, that wealth and possessions are not a subject that we should be afraid to explore. The way we handle our money and our assets then should be wholly integrated into our life as followers of Jesus and as church communities. Our generosity is a hallmark of our lived out faith and a testament to it. Great, so that's the end of my little introductory bit there. And Jenny and Christine are now going to take us through some ways that we can make that a reality in our church and faith communities.
Thanks, Daniel. So I'm just going to share my screen now, a moment. Sorry, I am trying to find this one. Okay. So if God is so generous to us, as Daniel has pointed out, given us that background, how are we going to respond and create a culture of generosity within our churches? And one of the ways we do that is to looking at where we are, what we already have as a basis for going forward. So I'm going to look at some giving reviews and programs, some of which you may be familiar with, but you may never have taken the plunge and got involved with any of them. I'm going to look at what they are, how we go about a giving review or a program, and what resources are available to help us. So first of all, a giving review. How would we really describe that? A simple giving review undertaken by the PCC. What is its purpose? And really, I'd say it's this, a tool to identify need and plan for the future. Bishop Phillips said, we need to start with a vision and the rest will follow. So never losing sight of what we are here for as a church, keeping the focus in the context of that wider vision, the need and impact of our giving. But a giving review is a tool which will back it up with a practical assessment of where you are. It's not a stewardship program or a wider church review, although it can lead to either of those. It's action undertaken by the PCC to assess the current situation. So why is that important? It really gives us a reality check and a starting point, a baseline. It means it's not based on feelings, because sometimes we feel very differently about our church to other times. It means there's not a condemnation of where the church is. It's not an opportunity to blame, to criticize, and to complain, which can often come about in a difficult time. It's an assessment which is undertaken practically and prayerfully, and it focuses on two main areas: the giving culture and generosity of the church, and how the church facilitates the practical application of generosity. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's really, how are you enabling people to be generous within the church environment and culture? So a giving review shouldn't be one of these three things. It shouldn't really be an appeal for more money. It's an assessment and not an ask. It shouldn't really be a response to a crisis, although it's often undertaken at the point of crisis. If it's undertaken regularly, then it may actually help to avert one instead. And a giving review is not really a box ticking exercise. It's to be put on a shelf and gather dust after you've gone through it all. It's supposed to be a first step, which will then produce recommendations which will be implemented in the church to help it to grow in generosity. So that's what it shouldn't be. It can be a celebration of successes. And we heard in those stories the answer to many prayers that we sometimes forget in the day-to-day what has been accomplished. And a giving review can bring out those points of success, what is going well. It can also be a catalyst for generosity. The wider congregation can see what the leadership is doing and acting responsibly and wisely, and without prompting, they can be spurred to greater generosity. And it can be a building block for mission and ministry. It is really an essential foundation, putting things into place. So what is the first step? The first step would really be a questionnaire to the PCC, a simple giving review within the church. And there is a guideline here. There are two questionnaire reviews that are put on the links to here. One's by the Church of England, which we'll have a look at in a moment, and the other has been produced by the Diocese of York. It's a little bit more detailed, more specific, and that can be very helpful in keeping us on track. So what does that look like if you go online and have a look at that giving review? You can download it and print it out for the PCC, which is exactly what we're supposed to do. It will take two parts. First of all, the giving culture of the church. Do we have a budget? Do we pay any attention to the budget? What is the culture of generosity in our church? And then the second part of a dozen questions on the practicalities of giving. How do we encourage regular giving in our parish? Do we make the most of gift aid? Does our church have a giving day a week or a generosity week? So you are assessing what is the current practice in your church environment. Step two would be this, that the PCC, having been given those sheets and answered those questions, would meet together to discuss and identify areas. And those would be three areas. I've put them all with an A, although I might have to explain some of them, but the three areas of these are areas for acclamation. That's to celebrate. It could be something you've identified, like we have a steady income stream from regular givers through parish giving scheme, which covers our MMF. Now that would really be something to celebrate, wouldn't it? But sometimes these things are overlooked. Then there is an area for action. That can be an immediate decision and commitment to change the way you are doing something. It could be a commitment to purchase through parish buying if you're not doing that already, or a commitment to send thank you letters once a year to regular givers if you're receiving income but not saying thank you for it. So those are things that don't need much further thought about them, but you can make quick decisions on that. This is the way we are going to act in the future. The third thing might take a little bit longer to put into place. And these are areas for attention. You may have realized that you've got a lot of visitors to your church and there's no way for them to actually give to you when they come in. You may have noticed that the church haven't increased their giving through 20, 30 years, and it could be that there's no giving program or teaching in place and hasn't been for some time. There are many areas likely to come up if you haven't had a review for many years, and a lot of churches haven't reviewed in the last 3, 5, 10, sometimes 20 years. So it's quite normal for areas to come up and be identified that need a little bit of attention or work on. After that time, after the first one you've done, of course, by revisiting yearly, you can keep a track on what's going well and what still needs to be done, what can be improved. And I would recommend, if you've got a lot of areas, to prioritize 2 or 3 of those areas for attention. But at this point, I'd say it's really good idea to speak to one of us, one of your generous giving advisors. Why do I say that? Do we want to be nosy and know what's going on in your church? Not really. I'll tell you why it's a good idea. There may be areas that come up for attention which you're really not comfortable with dealing with. It could be anything. If you're not very technically minded or you don't know much about card machines, it could be areas like that that constantly keep getting put on the back burner. but they could very quickly increase or enable generosity in your church. And what we can help to do is to alleviate some of those fears, talk you through the processes and equip you to address them so that they're not constantly being put off for another time if they're really important. And that's what we're here for. So please do use us as that sort of resource. Then when you've met together and you've had these areas that you can celebrate, areas of immediate action, areas that you want to implement, it's really important that you communicate those findings with the wider congregation. Now, churches are often accused of a lack of transparency. And often I find that the problem isn't one of any financial irregularity or intention to deceive, but simply of a lack of clear communication. So communicate with your congregation. Tell them, we said we'd have the review, we had the review. These are the results. This is what we have already committed to and actioned. And this is what we are planning in the future. So that would be a simple giving review. I'm just going to stop there in a second and just say, if you've got any questions at this point, very welcome to ask them, or we'll just go on and have them at the end. There may be some things that have come up. So
I guess it's also worth saying that for those watching this online after the fact, if you do have any questions, feel free to email them to us. Our contact details are all available from the diocesan website under the parish support section and then generous giving.
Great, so I'm going to just move on to the giving programme. So when you have had your giving review, you may decide to run some sort of giving programme or wider giving review within the church. You can call it what you like, stewardship, giving, generosity, but if you don't put it into the context of vision and need and impact of people's giving, people will always hear this same message. Oh, we're running a giving program. They just want to squeeze more money out of us. And so we have to present it in a way which is encouraging, which enables the church to outwork its vision, as Daniel was saying earlier on. So what is the point of any sort of giving program? The results of an Anglican giving survey run in 2020 were this, that 40% of Anglicans have never been asked to give regularly at all. And nearly half of Anglicans have never been asked to review their giving. And out of that, a key recommendation was to ask all members to review their giving as part of an annual giving campaign. And this is where an annual giving review may come in to the whole church. Now, it is an undertaking. It's not intended to be just a good idea run by a few fundraisers. We say this is to enhance the culture of generosity within the church, not for a quick fix, as it were. So when you're planning, you have to ask, is it the right time to be putting this program into place? And many of your churches will be going through on the way or just starting it, coming out of it. It needs to be planned in because it's an important part of that process as well, but for a time when you can give it your full attention and give it the prominence that it deserves. So the step one on this would be to pray. Giving programs and reviews, they're part of discipleship. So we pray that God will bless and increase the giver and bless and increase the church so that it can fulfill its vision in the community. And then step two really would be to plan, to design the program and dates. And again, this is something that we can help you with. When it comes to looking at resources, and we'll look at some of couple of the websites in a second, there is a huge variety of resources available. So it's a good idea to have a specific idea of in advance what you want to do and what you can manage. Keep it simple. Don't be overwhelmed with trying to do far too much. Do what you can according to the size of your church. And then step 3 would be to inform and communicate your intention to run the program and to let everybody know. This is a stewardship program, would be for every person, not just those people you think can afford to give or increase their giving. Don't exclude people, involve everyone in the process. Everyone's valuable and part of the church body. That way, you reinforce the message that you don't have to be rich to be generous. We can all increase in generosity. And so we have some programs available. I mentioned the Giving in Grace, huge resources available on the website, the link to which will be in these slides in a moment. You can do something like our annual review. And you will see from the outside cover of this and the inside of the leaflet that this comes out to the wider church once the giving review has taken place within the leadership of the church. That way you can say, in the past year, this is what we have done. This is our current situation. These are our plans for the future. And this is how we intend to finance those plans. A similar leaflet is a trifold leaflet, again, produced by Giving in Grace. Very similar. This is our vision. Now, I notice on this vision statement here, it's actually practical steps of outworking of that vision. But if you have a vision for your church, pop it on this leaflet. Let everybody know what the wider vision is that they are going to be involved in and why you particularly want to increase in your giving. Then there's how much. And when we need a clear picture of what is happening in the church. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the program on television, Dragon's Den, but all the investors say we want a clear resume of the past. You know, where are you now and what do you intend to do in the future? How do you intend to achieve that? And actually the reviews in the church are no different. We should be telling people this is what we intend to do, these are our plans, and this is how we intend to do it. And so the inside of that, it gives people, is clear in giving people options how to change their giving as well, step by step. So it's again reinforcing this is your church, this is, you know, this is ours, it's our challenge, our choices, our church. So if people have never given before, you might be saying to them in that challenge section, have you ever given? If they are giving, have you ever thought about increasing your giving? If they have been giving at a certain level for a while, you could challenge them about, have you thought about percentage giving or tithing if you want to speak about that? And show them the difference that the increase in income will make to the church. This is helping people to assess what they are investing in. There are 2 more programs available. I'm sure there are many more, but just looking at here at the Simple Giving program from the Church of England. And this is for smaller or rural churches. And again, this is engaging with the community around them. A huge variety of templates and teaching resources and ideas for a launch event. So this is something which takes place within not just the church community, but within the wider community. And the same with the next program, the Parish funding program. So you're taking your vision and you're sharing it with a wider circle of people. I like this, how it's set out. It's got 7 well-defined steps. And if you notice on the last things on there, if you can actually see that number 7 on there, it says Thanksgiving services and follow up. We're always grateful to God for what he has done, and there's always a follow up. So even at the end of the program, it shouldn't be right, that's it. It should be a follow on, so you get a continual culture of generosity, and you're creating that environment within the church. And all of those resources can be found at Parish Resources. You can order for free some of these leaflets, download them as PDFs from the website. There's Church Print Hub, which you can order the resources from, and the Generosity Learning Hub, which has got really good courses and sessions, especially for clergy and those speaking during the stewardship program, on sessions such as, why is this my job? How can I change things? And what in particular can I teach? And you'll find those very helpful. So that's it. I will stop my sharing now and pass on to Christine.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny. That was really good, really helpful, I think, to just think about the practical steps in how to look at giving and generosity in your church. I'm just going to share my screen now. I'm just going to look at some newer ways of thinking about generosity in the church and exploring and encouraging people to think about generosity. So I'm going to have a look at retreats and focus days. One of them is called the Generosity Fika, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. I'm going to look at small group study, individual study and reflection, and generosity weeks. So firstly, retreats or focus days. It may be that you would like in your church to spend some time really focusing on generosity, taking a day out, taking half a day out to just focus on generosity, get people thinking, perhaps before you launch a giving program or a giving review in your church. One way of doing this is the Generosity Fika. Now, Fika is a Swedish word. It's a Swedish idea, something that they do each day in Sweden. They gather together for conversation, for tea and coffee, and for up to 7 types of cake, which is rather lovely. So yeah, it's something that they do in Sweden, and it kind of embodies that generosity and hospitality, which we'd like to embody in our churches. So the Fika is a structured half-day session which explores God's generosity and gives us a chance to share our own experience of God's generosity. It looks biblically at generosity, and it looks at case studies of generosity from all around the world so that people can consider generosity in different contexts to their own. And it includes some films which have been produced by an organisation called Generosity Path. They produce another retreat resource called the Journey of Generosity, which is a longer one, a one-day one, that's also available online. But the Fika is a kind of smaller version of that draws on some of the resources. And there's various articles, activities and things that just help people to really engage with issues around generosity and discuss together what it means. So it's recommended that around 12 people are involved with this session. It may be that you want to involve more, but the people who developed this suggested that more than 12 people, it's difficult for everyone to contribute to a session, and fewer is a little bit small, and some people will dominate the conversation. But if you want to do this with your whole church, you could break up into smaller groups of 12 or less to discuss as well. Hold your Fika in a comfortable place rather than sitting in a cold church on hard pews. Maybe hold it in somebody's home, or if you have a comfortable church hall or village hall or a local cafe where you could hold it, where people can relax and just engage in a relaxed and comfortable environment. And obviously the AV equipment is needed for showing the videos and the different materials. So it's something that you might want to consider in your church. You just spend that half day, maybe on a Saturday morning. You can take that time out and really just focus. inspiring and encouraging people to live more generous lives and developing that culture in your church of generosity. So there's resources available for it. So it's very easy to run this yourselves as a church. The 3 little booklets in the picture there are available on the Church Print Hub. There's a handbook for the facilitators that leads you through how to run these sessions, and a handbook that can be given out to all the participants as well. And then a 3rd little book, which is reflections that are used during the sessions. So it's really easy for you to just pick these up and run it yourselves, but also we're here if you'd like us to come and facilitate this sort of session with you, we can do that too. And the Church Print Hub link is there. Lots of different resources are available there, so it's really helpful to go on there, and most of them are free. There are some that you pay for, but most of the resources can be ordered for free, just for the price of postage. So this is just an idea of how a fika would run, just for a morning, or it could be an afternoon. And there's those 3 videos that kind of form the main input there. The one about poverty, which is an amazing story from India, sacrificial generosity, which is from Los Angeles, from a deprived part of Los Angeles. And then generosity in crisis, which is all about rebuilding a community after civil war. And then, although these are different contexts to what we're used to, the discussion then from that can be applied to our own context. It looks at biblical generosity. There's all sorts of activities, creating a generosity web, which is an activity that people can really engage with and look at their own understanding of generosity. But you could do this in other ways as well. You could have a different sort of retreat day, or you could use some of the material from the fika or other materials, maybe over a few weeks, perhaps at evening sessions, 1 day a week. You could use some of the material there, use those videos, use some of the discussion points to run something over a few weeks. One church has had an idea of having a drop-in generosity day, where again, you have the tea and cake and the comfortable environment of the fika, but not necessarily running the fika as it is, but using some of those resources, perhaps running some of those videos, and perhaps having little presentations through the day to just get people thinking, get people discussing as they drop in and engage with that. But yeah, as Jenny was saying before, do invite us if you need us to come and help to facilitate your fika, to help think about how you might run a generosity day in your context. So another alternative to a retreat day is small group study. Perhaps you have a home group in your church and you could run a series of sessions in your home group all about generosity or about giving. If you don't have a home group, perhaps you could run a one-off course. Like I was saying earlier, maybe for 4 or 5 weeks, you could run evening sessions focused on generosity. And there's lots of resources available on the Church of England website that can help you run those sessions. So you don't need to invent it yourself. The resources are there for you. Or you can develop your own sessions. And again, we can help with that. We can, if you'd like us to input into that, we can. But those resources are there. This is just a little snippet from one of those resources that's available, Generosity, Gift and Grace, which is a course developed by Blackburn Diocese. It runs over 5 weeks, and each week there's a little video that you can watch. People can be inspired, and lots of resources that people can use to discuss. So near the bottom there, you can see the 5 weeks. There's one on God's character and God's generosity, one on being generous people, then generous giving, then generosity towards others, and finally church as a generous family. So it's a really nice course that takes you through thinking about generosity. As well as group study, individual study and reflection is really important. And it helps people to prayerfully consider their own response to God's generosity in the same way as the people in those videos that we saw had experienced God's generosity and were thinking about how they responded. If people are encouraged to study on their own, they can consider their own response. Again, there's lots of resources available for that. And this picture of Generous God, Generous People is a lovely series of daily Bible studies on the theme of generosity and Christian giving. So these sorts of reflections could maybe be things that people could be encouraged to use during a time leading up to a giving review or a stewardship program, or whatever name you want to give it. Or it could be used alongside a teaching program in your church. Perhaps there's teaching going on about generosity, about giving, and these resources could be made available. Similarly, with the group study, that might be something you want to engage in leading up to a time of giving review or a time of a stewardship program, just so that people can really engage themselves in the issues. Some other resources for individual study. We have our own blog, which Jenny has been writing. There's about 3 entries in that so far, but we'll be continuing with that. And again, that just helps people to reflect on different aspects of generosity. And there's these leaflets that are in the picture there, really nice little leaflets just with reflections in them. These are something that could be used again during a giving review or a teaching program. They could be just available in church so that people can go home and reflect a little bit more on what's been taught in the church. And again, those are available on Church Print Hub, and they're free as well. And finally, Generosity Week is a new idea which is designed to just get people thinking about generosity. It's a focused week in your church where you can have services at the beginning and the end of the week and activities going on throughout the week to help people reflect and consider generosity. And there's a lot of materials that have been produced that you can use for this. There's service materials for those 2 services if you wish to use them. There's podcasts with lovely inspiring stories about generosity, which there's a podcast for each day of the week, together with reflections, together with activities that you can use. There's resources for young people, there's resources for community engagement, all sorts of things that you can use for that focused week about generosity. And again, as I was saying with the study, it's something that you could use prior to a giving review or a stewardship program, so that people can already be thinking and considering their response to God's generosity. And the resources are all available on that link at the bottom. Okay, I think I've come to the end there. I don't know if you have any questions, Sylvia, on those. I might just stop recording there actually, and then if you have any questions, we can have a little chat.